Now that we've created our DRS cluster and we've configured the various rules and automation behavior that we want, let's see how we actually go about determining the current state of the load of a cluster and whether or not there's any DRS recommendations available to us, and then we can go ahead and implement those recommendations. So depending on the mode that you're running your DRS cluster, it may have already made its recommendations and implemented them. Otherwise, it may be making recommendations and waiting for you to take action and confirm that that's what you want to do. And again, we may want to do that during a period of less than peak activity, but once we're pretty confident that vMotion works and doesn't have too much of an impact, then we may want to move this cluster over to a higher level of automation. So I've got the cluster object selected, and I've gone ahead and created a bunch of machines and brought them up. Now I've manually placed these virtual machines in order to make sure that the system's going to generate some recommendations for us. So if we take a look at the summary tab of the cluster and move over towards the right, we're going to see there's a vSphere DRS section. Actually, you'll see on the left, there's a little bit of detail saying that vSphere DRS is on. But if we take a look over here, we can see that I'm currently in partially automated mode, which will place virtual machines at startup, but won't dynamically move virtual machines from one host to the other to improve load. But I could change that. We're not doing any power management automation yet. There are 2 DRS recommendations available based on our current cluster load. We can see that there hasn't been any DRS faults if we were in a higher level automated mode and fully automated mode, where the virtual machine couldn't be moved for one reason or the other, disks that were attached to non-shared storage, or maybe even just having removable media associated with it and being in use. And we can see the current migration threshold. Now, I'm actually in partially automated mode, so this is a little bit misleading because it's not going to apply priority 1, 2, and 3 recommendations unless I change it to fully automated. Now, that's the currently selected level of full automation, but I'm not running in full automation mode. This is interesting. We can see that the target host load standard deviation is 0.2. But in the current load for the cluster, we can see that we're actually at 0.949. So we can see that it is actually telling us that the cluster is load imbalanced, and of course that's why it has recommendations for us. But if we click over to View Resource Distribution Chart, we can actually see of the hosts in the cluster, which ones have greater load. If we hover over these, we can actually see which of the virtual machines are using more resources. And what's also interesting is that everything shows green here, which basically means that the virtual machines are getting what they need. If we were moving into yellow or red here, that would mean that the virtual machines were actually being starved of resources. So even though this cluster is very imbalanced, the one host that I have all the virtual machines running on is actually accommodating that load pretty well. It's currently showing the CPU distribution for the cluster. I can see that in percentage or in megahertz if we prefer. And if we click the memory button, we can see memory utilization in, again, both percentage and megabytes. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. And you'll notice there's also a link to view the DRS troubleshooting guide. We're not having any problems with DRS, so we don't really need to do that, but it'll bring us a link to a bit of documentation. So to take a look at the actual DRS tab of the DRS cluster now, when we go there, we can see that it actually does already have recommendations available for us. So it says that we should consider at least moving W2K8, R2, 5, and 4 from the first host onto the second one. Why those? Well, they're not necessarily the most used virtual machines. They actually are probably the machines that are less used that we'd like to move to another host in order to provide more resources for the virtual machines on that host that are in more use. Because, of course, if the virtual machines are in heavy use, those are probably not the ones that we want to start triggering vMotion events on, which is going to cause a performance impact. So typically we're going to move other less busy work away from that node in order to free up resources for the busier virtual machines. Now, of course, if I had put this in fully automated mode, I probably never would have got into this state and it would keep itself balanced automatically. So if I like, I can go ahead and just apply the recommendations by pressing the button. You'll notice there's also a checkbox saying override storage DRS recommendations. Technically, these are not storage DRS recommendations at all. If we select that, we can say that we want to implement some, but not necessarily all of the recommendations that are available for us. Now, at this point, this is actually not storage DRS because we're not moving the virtual machines from one data store to the other. We're moving them from one host to the other. But if you have the appropriate version of VMware, then storage DRS can optimize the placement of virtual machines on various LUNs and ensure that SAN load balancing and IO balancing is happening automatically. So I'm going to leave that as is. I'm just going to go ahead and click Apply Recommendations here, and surprisingly enough, it's going to start actually migrating the virtual machines that it recommended and that I had selected. If I wanted to, I could click Run DRS again in order to see if there's any other recommendations that it might make. But probably leave it a little bit of time for something statistically significant to happen. If I click up in the View section here, you'll notice we have a false entry. So if there were DRS triggered vMotions that weren't able to be carried out, we'd be able to see that, and we can make sure that we're not neglecting to clean up removable media and other disks and so on from testing or troubleshooting or deployment. It is very important that we allow the automated vMotion to happen. And if we click over to this history button, we can see what's been happening when we initially start a virtual machine. We refer to that as placement, and migrations are the live vMotion migrations that happen afterwards. Go back onto the Recommendations tab here, and either I can go back to the cluster properties directly, or we can access the cluster properties from here. And if I wanted to, I might want to move that into fully automated mode and then generate some activity of some sort and have it apply the recommendations for us. In fact, if we wait long enough, if these recommendations are still valid, it should go ahead and implement them. But it would be best for me to go and generate some work inside the virtual machines. Okay, well, I don't need to do that. We can see that it has actually gone ahead and picked up the recommendation it had for W2K8R2-4 and is going ahead and moving it over to the other node in the cluster. If we wanted to see the placement of virtual machines in the cluster and look at how it was done and move any of them manually, then you'll see as well we have a Virtual Machines tab. That gives us a bit of an idea as to what the virtual machines are using, and we can see where they're currently placed, and we can go ahead and just right-click Migrate from here and move them around manually if we want to. Now, in order to ensure that we can increase our likelihood of being able to carry out successfully automated vMotions on demand, what we may want to do is go into the cluster and take a look at the maps. So now that we're in the cluster 1 object, as we were before, we saw the DRS tab, we saw the Virtual Machines tab. If we move over to the Maps tab, we can actually see how the different virtual machines are related to the hosts and the data stores and so on. So that gives us a little bit of an idea as to how to review the DRS recommendations and implement them if we want to do that, if you're running in a partially automated mode. But we also saw that by putting the DRS cluster into a fully automated mode, we don't need to take any action for it to not only place virtual machines when we initially start them, but also to dynamically load balance them throughout the cluster. So that really wraps up the DRS section. We can't really go into storage DRS, but we've seen now through a series of a few different videos how to configure it, how to get your cluster built and get the hosts into it, and then how it actually works on an ongoing basis.